Welcome to Up Close. I'm your host, Professor Donald Jones, and we're here with distinguished attorney Tara Faenza to address the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And more specifically, the issue of lawyers of color and the unique challenges they face as they negotiate their way through the corridors of corporate law and government. And more specifically than that, the whole question of how do we deal with implicit bias? How do we deal with stereotypes? How do we overcome the barriers that decades, generations of Jim Crow has created? And let me begin by saying welcome. Welcome, Tara. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And I still have fond memories of you at UM as one of my students. And I was always impressed when you would speak. And I said, is this one of my students, or do I have a visiting senior attorney who's come to visit my class? And so, you honored me by taking my classes. And I want to honor you by putting a spotlight on you and your accomplishments. But even more than that, and that goes out saying, you're one of the super lawyers, recognized as one of the super lawyers. You're cutting a swath through the forest of the law. But one of the things that's interesting is that as people of color and as a woman of color, I've talked to you about, you're comfortable with that designation. Yes. As a woman of color, I believe that we all, and as people of color, face a unique set of challenges. I think it's Charles Hamilton Houston who says, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite. And so for a person of color, you can't just be a lawyer, you also have to be an agent of change.
Yes.
Now, at the same time, as we fight and we wield legal arguments like swords to fight against injustice, at the same time, we also are sometimes put upon in our law firms, in our offices, by the problem of implicit bias, microaggression. And so as a Black person, I've faced that. And I'm wondering, as a woman of color, as a woman whose heritage includes an Asian background, do you also face those issues?
So I'm glad you asked that question. And it's interesting because the way that I face it is in something that Title VII, the EEOC, the Florida Commission on Human Relations deals with, which is the word perceived. And so being perceived as a particular race, and to sort of quote you, race is in the eye of the beholder, can create certain stereotypes, certain expectations, and also put you in a room to hear things. I believe you call it the back room, where people express how they really feel about your actual race or other races that you may have affiliations with. So generally speaking, because Miami is so predominantly Hispanic, because we have a strong Latino, Hispanic community that's proud and supportive of each other, I have been somewhat immune from many forms of microaggression or outright racism. Generally speaking, it's not something that I will see. It will typically be much more implicit or much more hidden. However, because there's a perception that I may be Hispanic or whatever race anyone happens to think, generally speaking, because
sometimes they think you're Hispanic, she's Hispanic like us.
Correct. And I am honest with people, although I did learn to speak Spanish as an attorney, as an adult, because I felt it was important for my community. I'm honest and I tell people I'm not Hispanic, but I'm extremely supportive of this community. And I think it's important that Miami, the United States, Florida become eventually bilingual. We are a bilingual and a Hispanic country from our roots. However, I don't want to give anyone the impression that I am misappropriating or pretending to be something that I'm not. So as a result of being put in a sort of back room where people think, sometimes they think I'm Caucasian. That's a bizarre compliment when someone will say, oh, wow, I thought you were just 100% white. It's an innocuous comment, but it's an implication that somehow being 100% anything, aka purebred, is a compliment. It's just who you are.
Right,
You
right,
could
right,
be
right, right, right.
100% Caucasian, and that's not better or worse. It's just who you are as a person. But
So in the
it's
21st century, people are still saying, "I thought you were 100% white,"
and smiling.
which would suggest that they think race matters. And so, in the midst of this so-called colorblind, the society that transcended race, in a post-racial moment, it's not post-racial. They still seem to think that, oh, so you're not.
Correct.
And
And it's sort of the old paper bag test. Oh,
mhm,
you're light enough. Oh, you're fair enough. Oh, you could pass. And so as a person who does employment law for a living, who's aware of social issues, I do get a certain privilege. I'm
mhm.
well educated. I have fair skin.
Yes.
For my race, I do. Compared to someone else, I might not. Maybe not compared to a white person,
But
I might be
how do you
tan.
see your race? Do you see yourself as uh, multi-ethnic? Do you see yourself as a particular ethnicity? Just help me to know how you see.
So I grew up with an immigrant parent. My mother, who passed last year, is from Taiwan.
Hmm.
So I am Asian American. I also grew up with the understanding that comes from having an immigrant parent, hearing her struggle with English.
Hmm.
So when we were young, my dad was in the military. One of the places we were stationed was in Montgomery, Alabama, which is not San Francisco, where I spent the majority of my life. And I remember my mom picking me up from school one day, broken English, having a hard time, assimilating in Deep South. And she was crying and pulled
Hmm.
over and said to me, "Get in the car." So I got in, and I had been walking with some friends. And I asked her, "Mom, why are you crying?"
Hmm.
And her response was, without looking at me, "I see where you fit." All of my friends were Black. When I was coming home and telling my mom, "Oh, I want to have a perm." Granted, it was the 80s. Okay. So that was the thing. But Mom, how come my hair doesn't braid like my friends? Why is my hair different? Mom, why is my skin so fair? I need a tan. And all of a sudden it came together and she understood, oh, this is where you are. And it also became clear to her that as minorities, as her being first born in another country and coming here, she was not viewed equal to white
Hmm.
people. And that, in fact, that experience of living in the Deep South was so impactful to see that for many people, it's not that they ask a question like you did. That takes an evolved person who cares about how people feel about their race. But there are people who say it's white and then not white. It's not even a black and white issue. So it's not just having something in my background that showed up on a
Hmm.
23andMe. It's about growing up with a parent who came from another country. It's being a child and hearing people make fun of your
So
mother's
part of your
accent.
experience is the immigrant
That
experience,
is correct.
and with blacks, perhaps with immigrants true, but it's forced
It's forced.
immigration, and so
It's
there's a
forced.
different. But let me ask this question, and I think it's important for our viewers. You are a well-educated person, so when you use the term front stage and backstage, you know what it means. But let's explain to our audience. The front stage represents what black people tend to see. You see a smiling face. You see people who perform as if they're colorblind as much as they can in proper settings, putting the new Confederacy aside in polite settings. That's what we see in the boardroom and in the courts, but on television. But when whites go back home, when they talk to their parents, when they talk to their buddies over a beer, that's the backstage. That's where very often they will express ideas which sometimes be hateful, sometimes just insensitive. And so what you're saying is because you have I don't want to use the term passing because that's not appropriate, but nonetheless you can move between different worlds
Correct.
because people perceive you in a way that in different ways at different times. And so you're actually able to hear what we would call backstage racism or
That's correct.
backstage bias. And so that's almost like a double consciousness in which you can see from both sides.
Well, and sometimes I've heard people say, for example, probably 20 years ago, there was a very smart young woman that worked with me when I was before law school in a corporation. She happened to be African American, and she had been accepted to, I want to say, either Hastings or University of Berkeley Law School, which is, those are both top schools, full ride scholarship. And everyone threw her a big party and talked about how great she was. And then privately, a couple of other women, which surprised me, who happened to be white, made a comment that that accomplishment was achieved through affirmative action.
Oh my God.
That it must have been related to her race. And I could say really nothing. I could really compromise nothing in my own career. That person had left. There's not really an HR complaint, I guess, for me to make. I was awfully young at the time. But it just struck me that first, there's a complaint that people don't move ahead and better themselves, right? There's this sort of, and look at this evidence. And then when people do, the assumption is that they've done it solely because someone else gave them that opportunity. And so it sort of explains why when we see persons of color actually doing great things and helping people, not just other people of color, then there's a perception that, well, I gave them that opportunity and now they're taking it from me. And so this is the dialogue I hear in the background. That's a probably soft sort of discussion. I've heard people use the N-word flat out. And I have
against black people
100% in 2020 and 2021. And it depends on who it is that's saying it. Is it your boss? Is it a client? Is it someone very influential? What can you then do with that negativity that they don't view as hurled on you because they don't see you as a person of color, perhaps, or maybe they feel a relationship with you because they think you're part of their race. But the N-word is used more often than not. And in fact, I had an individual say to me, well, I'm offended that I can't use the N-word, which I found interesting. And so part of that microaggression right there is to sort of inquire, well, why? And so the response was, well, because they use it. And my question is obviously, who are you perceiving as they? Well, other Black people use it, you know, for example, okay, rap stars or actors. And so then my response is, are you a rap star or an actor? Are you a performer? And if not, why do you feel that that one word is some kind of infringement on your liberty to not use it? Why is it that you want to use it? And at that point, obviously, it was not an attorney. The argument sort of fell apart. And it became clear it's just an anger. It's an irritation. But had that person known that my ex-husband is mixed race and his father was African American, had that person known how deeply I feel, how fervently I feel about equal rights for every person, irrespective of race or gender or national origin, or if they're homosexual or straight, I believe that we should strive to be as close to egalitarian as possible. That person wouldn't have said that, but she did. And it's interesting because she would not have said it if I were Black or she perceived me as Black. So
understood.
Use of the N-word. And I think, was there not a study done on lawyers where there was an assessment of work in one assessment when they looked at senior partners and they were unaware of race, the Black person's work was considered better or equal to the white person's. And when there was an understanding of what the race of the person was, automatically the Black person's work was considered less.
Now, I don't know that study, but I do know that similar studies have been done about employment. So, for example, if a white person has something on their something of a criminal record, they still have a good chance of getting a job. A Black person with that, it's 10 times worse. I may not characterize it with statistical precision, but there's a huge disparity in the way we perceive the same event, depending on the race of the person who we associate that with.
And I think the EEOC discussed that in their 2012 guidance, which acknowledged an implicit bias as far as who gets arrested, and that it's disparately proportioned towards greater Black and Hispanic men, and how if an employer would like to use a criminal conviction, of course, not just an arrest, but an actual conviction of guilt, that it should consider that it isn't a disparate impact on certain groups. So certain types of arrests, for example, marijuana, which is now legal in many states, simply having that conviction is probably not something that you could argue would not disproportionately impact Black and Hispanic men. It most
That's
certainly
the problem
would.
of false positives and false negatives. And so, but it's also interesting to know that a stereotype represents a mistake. And so most people think that racism is hate, but hate is not necessary for modern racism. So what happens with a stereotype, you conflate, you confuse, this is the image with a real person. And you think you're seeing, let's say you see a person with saggy pants and twisty braids, you think you're seeing a thug. It may be an Ivy League student home from Yale, and but who just happens to be Black. And so stereotypes are very dangerous things. They're windows, lenses. And so it's interesting and Blacks experience all the time. So it's interesting for me to ask this question. That is whether you feel that you face that. Now, I note with interest that historically Asians have been stereotyped.
Correct.
As the model in recent years, as quote, the model minority.
Right.
I don't know whether you like or dislike that term. How do you feel about that? But do you feel that you are in the cross eyes of that lens of stereotyping as an Asian American lawyer?
So it's interesting being mixed race. It really depends on how much more you look Asian and how much more you look white, or how mixed you look. I think I look pretty mixed. I'm not sure that people instantly acknowledge this person is Asian. So obviously I'm very proud of my Asian brothers and sisters who have come here. English is not particularly easy to learn if your native language is Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean. It's not something that's super simple. To come here first, second generation, immediately begin building wealth, immediately performing well academically. But it has nothing to do with the person's race. It has to do with the efforts, with the focus of those people. And rather than looking and saying, well, perhaps this is an immigrant group that has performed well because they have a new opportunity here and they may have the financial means to be successful, whether they're owning their own business, whether they have a strong group to help support them be successful, whatever it happens to be. That perception of the model minority can be very negative in many ways. I don't generally feel it, again, because people don't perceive me that way, but certainly at home, when my mom would tell me, oh, well, Brian Chen got a perfect SAT score. And that was an expectation. An A- was not acceptable. And some of it had to do with, even if I performed well academically, I was compared to other Asian students, even teachers that would say, well, you did very well, but of course you're Chinese. It creates this idea that you don't have to work hard, which is false. For those people who perform exceptionally well, they worked hard. Maybe they do have higher IQs. I don't think that's relative to race, and I'm not aware of any empirical studies that suggest that it is connected to race. But B, it suggests that somehow it's a passive. And for a minority group to achieve so much, coming to the United States, for a minority group to have so much, to then categorize that as, well, you're just the model minority, it's because you're Asian, is actually very negative. So what comes off as a positive stereotype really takes away from the struggle, the efforts, and in fact, discrimination that we've seen come full circle with Asian hate. And it's upsetting. It's sort of like when people say, well, of course that guy's a great basketball player, he's Black.
Right. Black people have twitch muscles. I think in my first book, it was called Race, Sex, and Suspicion. I did a study of how people conceptualize Black athletes. Now, historically, for example, when an athlete would race a horse, it wasn't the athlete, and Blacks played a large role in horse racing in the early 20th century. If the horse won, it was the horse that got the credit. The Black jockey was just like an appendage. A saddle. He had no. They didn't recognize him in any way, and so often when they see Blacks winning, when they see LeBron James, Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, then they say, well, it's because of their gene pool. It's not because of their talent. It's their gene pool, and the achievement is diminished because you have this. The Blacks have these twitch muscles, you see. you
Right.
know, and which is an insult. But of course, it really is hard work. And there's a certain genius. For example, when Muhammad Ali would fight, he used extreme ring generalship, strategy, chess. He was like a chess player.
Right.
And they deprecate the kind of what I would call it athletic intelligence
Yes.
that many black athletes have. And so what you're saying is that you feel that this model minority stereotype does something similar. It's almost like somewhere in your gene pool you have this extra, you know, achievement gene
Right.
or math gene.
I can 100% assure you that Asian Americans who've had tremendous success, and Asians, period, who've had tremendous success, it's because of hard work.
Mm-hmm.
It's because they wanted it, they did what it took to get it done, and they continued to try in spite of discrimination against them, in spite of elevated expectations, in spite of preconceptions about them for nothing other than the way that they appear due to their race.
Right.
So they don't wake up in a neutral environment where there's no expectation that they are in any way. There is an expectation the moment they walk in the door by their presentation. Well, here comes 3 Asian students. They must all be the top of the class.
Right.
That isn't necessarily true. Each person is their own self. They have their own problems. They have their own issues. They have their own challenges. And so it really takes away from the accomplishment, and it disadvantages those people. If I'm just back in the classroom, those students that you don't know that child or that adult doesn't have dyslexia or a learning disability, doesn't need additional assistance. Being Asian doesn't make you immune to that. You know, being Asian doesn't make you immune to having a rough home life or suffering extreme poverty. There are Asian groups who are extremely poor. And that can be mirrored in really many different type of minority groups. So, for example, the idea that all individuals who are Jewish are wealthy is simply false. There are many Jewish people who have needs, who need their community to support them and suffer substantial discrimination still. Since moving to South Florida, despite there being such a substantial Jewish community, what I was shocked by was hearing so many anti-Semitic remarks, which I found frankly bizarre and deeply saddening. Coming from a place like California, that was really just right up there with the N-word. Not really. It was really odd. I had never heard overt comments like that. And I frankly have no understanding, or I reject, but I just do not understand where stereotypes come from for specifically that group. Or any other. I mean, when we look statistically, is it not true that African-American women are now the top growing, most well-educated group in the United States?
No doubt.
That isn't the stereotype associated with that group who has worked so hard to come to that point. Instead, Black women are perceived as angry if they're not smiling.
Right.
Why does someone have to be smiling all the time?
The angry Black woman, there's several. There's the Jezebel, the angry Black woman. But let me ask this question. What is the source of this? So do you see these stereotypes that you face and the Blacks face? Do you see these stereotypes as coming from an unconscious, something in the id, something, Freud talks about the unconscious. Is it unconscious? Is it implicit? Or do you see it as hate? How do you see it?
Well, there is some hate, for sure. But I think the other thing, which may or may not be popular, I don't really care, is understanding that racism isn't binary. It's not yes or no. This person made this comment, therefore horrible racist, and we should cancel them. I don't think that's the direction to go. People can have microaggressions from ignorance. That may be all that they were exposed to. It may be actually correct and true to their experience. And that's where I think some of this indignance comes from of, well, I'm speaking my truth. It's true. It may be offensive. It may be inaccurate and incorrect, but a microaggression expressed that way, both could be correct. And there's an opportunity to learn and expose that person without humiliating, without trying to cancel them. So to some extent, even some things that are very offensive that you would wish, how do you not know that that's offensive? Sometimes it comes from a place of ignorance through no fault of that person's own. We can't be the world. We can't all know everything. I certainly don't. And Sometimes
Right.
it's the other side of an overly quote unquote woke person who feels, since I care, therefore I can't possibly have a bias.
That's
Right.
hilarious. But I think what's interesting is that many people seem to think of racism as something an individual does, and so we typically speak as you do of individual, and that certainly is an aspect of it. But one of the things I'm fascinated by is the extent to which racism is rooted in the practices of society, and how racism. I think that the racism that I'm most concerned about is rooted in social in narratives that are deeply embedded in us. For example, one of the things that's interesting is that from the time of the beginning of the civil rights movement, there's been this narrative, we call it a narrative of imposition, and that when blacks achieve something in terms of civil rights, they achieve it at the expense of other groups. So when blacks move into a neighborhood, they are now moving the neighborhood. Their equality is at the expense of whites. The neighbor, oh, there goes the neighborhood. When blacks get, maybe we allow 10 blacks in Berkeley. Oh no, we're lowering the standards of the university and so forth. And how do you feel about? Is there? Do you perceive this narrative to be evident in your work? And just what do you think?
So I work in employment discrimination. That is
Yeah.
my area of work, is sort of general liability litigation and then discrimination.
Yes.
So I see it probably more than most people will. There are perceptions that people who have succeeded have done well based on stereotypes. It's because of their race and that they were given chances they didn't deserve. I've had someone say, well, I feel like people of color are getting jobs more frequently and they're getting it because they're of color, which makes no sense. There is no fact, no law, nothing to support that. And there are people who feel the push towards being more inclusive and mirroring what our actual demographics and our specific areas are like is a way of excluding white people from opportunities. And not necessarily just white, it could be anyone else outside of that protected class. So that narrative, I think, continues to rise.
The narrative of imposition.
And in sometimes it's a person that, well, they'll say, well, immigrants or these people or these Muslims or these Asians, they're taking jobs.
That's
Right.
a mirror image
Correct.
of what black.
Exactly.
So when immigrants come in, they take jobs from black people. When immigrants come in, they're making life more difficult for us native-born people.
Correct.
So that's interesting. I still remember when there was a woman named Carrie Meek who passed, God rest her soul. She used to say, "Well, we may have come here in different ships, but we're in the same boat now."
Yes.
And so and in fact, one of the things I write about in my recent book is called Dangerous Spaces Beyond the Racial Profile, is this idea that immigrants are criminals, that immigrants are causing crime, that immigrants are here just to have babies so that they can. And then there's also this idea that this is a reconquista. So, but what's interesting is that immigrants are hardworking. Immigrants cause less crime than their native counterparts, and yet they've been tagged with this. And so, does that play a role in your work?
I do see that frequently. I do see that there are those misperceptions that exist. The type of roles that, if you were to actually look, are being taken by immigrants are ones for which we can't find people to do some of those jobs. They're horrific jobs. They're terrible jobs.
Right.
There's a lack of understanding. Of course, I do a lot of wage and hour work as well, which relates to being paid a fair minimum wage. It's a fair amount of individuals, because they're off the books, that are exploited and paid beneath the minimum wage, worked horrific hours, abused, and then discarded. And I think it's because people literally have said, without giving credit to anyone or drawing more attention to any person, immigrants are criminals. And there's a thread of truth to it. Are there immigrants who have committed criminal acts? Yes. Are there also U.S. citizens or
Some
people
of
here
them are white
lawfully?
immigrants.
Correct. To commit a crime is to be human.
Yeah.
Right. To have a child is to be human. To want to succeed, to want to work is to be human. We all have a human need to
Yes.
survive. So it really just vilifies the human existence based upon something that we can separate. And that is by no means a political statement to say, well, we should just allow anyone in. That's not what that means. It means that all of the things you've just said, bear children, work, make mistakes, all of those things are human. Somehow that's different because someone else did it. And this idea of I got here first, it's mine, appears to be something that is persisting. But we've all come here at different times. It's true, we're all in the same ship, but this desire to divide, I think, is also part of the human condition. We're always looking for a pecking order. So when it was...
We must fight again. I think one of the things you said, and this is your statement, what unites us is greater than what divides us.
That is correct. I mean, initially when we were... when the United States was dealing with immigrants from Italy, from Poland, from Ireland, there was discrimination towards white immigrants that came to the United States.
They weren't considered white, by the way.
They were not. They were not. I think that Asian Americans have a special relationship with African Americans in the sense that we weren't, I think, even considered almost on the same level as people when first coming to the United States, and often servants, slaves, working on railroads. So we came to a point where some of that has been accepted and we've been able to move on from some of it. But I feel that there's this undercurrent of people being tired of having to grow and change and learn, wanting to rest upon what they've already known and not change. And so that's when I hear
resisting the future
and their present.
I'm reminded of a writer who says the past is not past. And in the context of race, we're always struggling with the past being imposed and inscribed on the present through racism and hate. I want to thank Tara Faenza, distinguished lawyer, graduate, University of Miami, my former student.
Thank you.
For coming and gracing this studio. I want to wish you continued success, as you get future awards for being a super lawyer, as you did recently. And just say thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your compassion. You've been watching Up Close, a social justice program. We've been talking with Tara Faenza about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of being a person of color and a woman of color in Miami. Thank you again.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank
God
you.
Bless. I love the song.
You do?
At last.
Yeah, it's a good song.
God bless you.
Thank you.
God bless you.